we are excited to have a wonderful group of presenters from our government today who are going to talk about the national priorities that are being invested around TBI in their specific areas. Dr. Hoffman from the VA will speak first, followed by Dr. Bellgowan with NINDS, Dr. Peña with FDA, and potentially later we may have one more speaker as well. Dr. Hoffman, thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out to this, so far, really excellent meeting. Before I start, I just want to really emphasize that the partnership that we have, the collegiality that we have between the agencies has been very special. Started off, I guess, with Dr. Hack when he was a colonel, and it has continued on from Mona Hicks to Pat Bellgowan. It's been a series of, and the other people at CDMRP. It's been a very special relationship between the agencies, and we do work very closely together on a lot of policy issues and moving research forward. So I just want to thank my colleagues before I begin. So I guess I can move around. I'm not mic'd here. I'm wired up. So okay, that's how it works. Okay. So I work for the Department of Veterans Affairs. Unlike the other agencies, we do not see TBI in the acute phase. We see it months to years afterwards. I think the earliest might be in the polytrauma, where service members can come in while they're still in uniform and be treated for polytrauma at one of the 5 polytrauma sites. But typically it's months to years after the injury that we diagnose the brain injury. And so, with that mindset, going back further in time, chronic TBI research was fairly small. It was done by maybe a few people. So when you look at this graph of funding, yes, it started off very low, and then when we realized that there was these repetitive mild brain injuries occurring from the wars, the funding jumped up. And I came in on this story about 2010, and it has been a pretty good ride since then of increasing funding. You see some dips up there in the last few years or so. That was from when we had that big bolus. Those funded studies were rolling off, and new ones had to roll on. And so there was some lag in funding, but pretty much it's been an increasing amount in number of projects over the years. Okay, so if you go back, so we're going back to about 2011 now, when Dr. Hack and I first started talking about getting some long-term study together. And around the same time, we were approached by the White House with an initiative that was going to be announced relatively soon in the coming year about getting the invisible wounds such as PTSD, TBI, as well as suicide prevention, because suicide was already was being seen as a real problem coming up, unfortunately. And so even back then, we realized that it was a growing problem, and also more communication between the agencies with sharing of data. So there was an executive order that was announced. Most of this was basically regarding the care of people with mental health issues and TBI. But there's one section that was dedicated to the research in the areas of these invisible injuries. And so at the time, it was HHS, DOD, VA, and education. Since then, NIDR has become NIDLR, and when it was moved from education into HHS. So it's 3 agencies at this point. And so the NRAP was released that basically brought us all together officially. We all had relationships before then, but it became an official relationship there. Okay. And so in response to that executive order, there was a National Research Action Plan that basically codified our relationships together. And it also announced bigger projects. And so this is where we now sort of branch off here, but the National Research Action Plan called for research in TBI, called for it in PTSD, with longitudinal studies looking at diagnosis and other issues and treatments. And so what I have here on the screen is some of the people who were involved in writing that response to the executive order that set what we're going to be basically talking about today in motion. And so one of the things that was called out, one of the big projects that was called out in the National Research Action Plan was the Chronic Effects of Neurotrauma Consortium. Dr. Dave Sifu, who's the PI, he's standing here, and as Colonel Sid Hines and Rick Williams, in the past co-PI who's sitting in the audience, Dr. Ramon Diaz-Aristia, helped form this consortium. And it was picked among several competing groups, and it was funded by both the DoD and the VA for over $62 million. 37 of that came from the DoD, about 25 came from the VA, and it was going to look at the longitudinal follow-up of veterans and service members, the psychological aspects, and neuroendocrine deficits, biomarkers, and that is still actually going on today. And during this time of putting this together, and over the last 5 years, the Sensi, led by Dr. Sifu, has expanded to a number of sites across the country. A lot of them are places where there's active enrollment of veterans and service members. And some other sites are more research-driven sites, but they're all part of this large consortium that's funded by 2 different agencies. And so there's basically 6 main studies that or groups of studies in this consortium. The first one is, as I just mentioned, is a longitudinal study. 82% of the individuals have TBI, 18% do not. They were screened for a whole bunch of psychological and neuropsychological conditions. They were put in MRI machines, extensive MRI imaging, electrophysiology. There was biofluids taken and stored, and thanks to Dr. Kenny for that, heading up that core of the consortium. I guess I'll stop periodically, because a number of the people who are part of this and other aspects I'll be talking about today are actually in the room. If I forget to mention your name, I apologize in advance. There's also a major, very successful retrospective study of looking at the databases between the VA and the DoD, and combining it together to get some very interesting data, which I actually will show here. There are also 6 additional prospective studies that were reviewed and approved by their own peer review committee within the consortium. There was a basic study of human tau producing mice exposed to repetitive concussions that was headed up by Dr. Fiona Crawford, who's in the room too. And finally, one of the things that the National Research Action Plan called out for was better diagnostic. So yeah, we're developing biomarkers, but how can we improve other aspects like imaging? So how can we standardize and calibrate imaging so it could be that long-term follow-up tool to look at brain health? And so Lisa Wild, along with Walt Schneider, have been spearheading the DTI Phantom development that actually began with DoD funding and also was launched by a very good roundtable at the Institute of Medicine back in 2013. So here I'll go quickly because I don't want to take away too much time. So that's really great database that was combined from DoD and VA sources, looked at over 2 million individual cases. And what they found, and this is a study that was headed up by the epidemiological team, Mary Jo Pugh is in the room too, that's part of that team. And Christine Yaffe was the other major person for this. And so their 2 teams worked together. They found that TBI at any level dramatically increased the risk of dementia based upon VA records, ICD-9 codes, and things like that. So it's not exact, But there is in the rate of dementia is dose dependent on the level of injury. And likewise, also of Parkinson's, they found similar aspects. All brain injuries increased it. The worse the brain injury, the greater the risk of Parkinson's. Now, one of the aspects that we talked about before already is the mental health issues, and also, I'm not sure if it was mentioned, I had to step out of the room for a little bit, but chronic pain issues. So chronic pain, headache, I think that was mentioned, is pretty big in this population. And that also is dependent upon the severity of brain injury. And that is critical because one of the aspects of TBI is behavioral inflexibility. If you have something that hurts, it's hard for you to get your mind off of it. So the complaints, the utilization of services is much higher in the TBI population than some other populations. So before the realization of the opiate epidemic, a lot of veterans were seeking help with their pain, and the response was pain medication. And the pain usage in this population increases not only with severity, but with co-occurring mental health conditions, such as depression and PTSD. So these are pretty, and I'll circle back to this slide at the end of the talk after a couple more, but that's a critical aspect that may be affecting brain health going forward. So what are the next steps for Sensi? And if Dave is out there, he can always correct me. One is that the longitudinal study, this is sort of, it should be in past tense. They expanded their recruitment. They've been overachievers. They actually more than met their goal of number of subjects in the study. And they're currently still expanding and analyzing the biomarkers, which are, that's no small task, and there's some very exciting data, which I cannot speak about today, that's coming from Kimber Kenny and Dr. Gill. Then also the epidemiological study, very successful. That mining of that data is still going on. One thing there's two parts to this consortium. One is the science that's going on in recruiting, but the other is that it's a reservoir, it's a resource for a clinical trial population that other TBI studies, maybe like Dave Brody's, and there's another one I'll be mentioning, can utilize, can get highly characterized subjects from that have been followed for a period of time. So that is a rich resource for those who would like to collaborate. And next is what I talked about is the image standardization and calibration initiative called the Clinical Health Imaging Portability Standards. So taking the normative database that was mentioned before, as well as calibration devices also called phantoms, and cooperation with the manufacturers, be able to make magnetic resonance imaging something of a clinical standard that can be, that you have a portability of image from one machine to another without having a problem with the software upgrades or variation over time, having that core stability, much like what CAT scans are today. CAT scans were standardized and calibrated back in 1984. No one thinks about it. There's many manufacturers, but they're all, you can compare images far back to the ones that are taken today. The goal is to make MRI the same. And so now I just want to talk about some of the funding initiatives. One is this one that was awarded this past year to Dr. Zezong Gu, who's actually in the audience. And this is to start a veteran-centric open field blast preclinical site that is also going to be a resource to other VA investigators to look at veteran-centric blasts. It means repetitive blasts and the chronicity of the effects and looking at it over time, so we can develop treatments and understand the injury much better than we do today in our veteran population. Next is a very innovative announcement from Biomedical Laboratory Research and Development, one of the services in the Office of Research and Development, that is bringing, through field-based meetings, bringing a diverse group of investigators together and allowing them to synergize and synthesize new ideas and propose joint funding effort, joint merits. That's what we call our RO1s, to develop innovative research. And in the service I belong to, the Rehab Research and Development Service, we don't do separate RFAs that much anymore. What we do is areas of emphasis. And one is using exoskeletons, both for mobility and for rehab. And the other is, circling back to that earlier slide, that opiates have a lot of effects on the body, especially the immune system. And there seems to be a relationship between inflammation and the chronic degeneration maybe taking place in the brain of sports and veteran sport athletes and contact sport athletes and veterans, that may be related to chronic inflammation. And it'd be interesting to see whether the exposure, chronic exposure to opiates over a period of time initiates any of these processes. And finally, this is a study based upon one of the first projects that were funded in my portfolio when I came on in 2010, was the growth hormone deficiency in veterans who've had multiple mouths. And that was through Charles Wilkinson out in Puget Sound. He has been working together with other people over the years, especially Jose Garcia, and who has successfully proposed an LOI that has gotten to the planning stage. So this is not a definite study yet, but it's in the process. And so it's going to be looking at those veterans with adult growth hormone deficiency who have a history of TBI to see if their deficits and quality of life can be improved with supplementation with growth hormone. And with that, I will turn over to my colleagues for their talks.
All right, so thanks, Stu, particularly for covering the National Research Action Plan, so the rest of us don't have to. And I'm also not going to talk about FIPR, so you don't all have to run. So I'm the program director at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, which is the primary institute for TBI at NIH. The TBI is covered by 12 different institutes at NIH. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through and discuss with you about, a real broad overview of how TBI is funded at NIH, and I'm going to just give you 3 examples of initiatives that we're moving forward. There are other areas that we're focusing on and trying to push forward, but hopefully we can have discussion and we can talk about those. And if not, you can always, my job is to come ask me questions, so please do. So NINDS's investment in TBI, as most of you know, is the full spectrum, which goes all the way from basic disease neuroscience. So we have studies in fly models of TBI all the way to a phase 3 clinical trial, of which the PI is here, Ramon. Primarily what we're doing is looking at disease mechanism, trying to develop biomarkers and these early phases of potential therapeutics. Here you can see, interestingly, this is the funding at NIH portfolio for TBI. This is publicly available. You can do these analysis on NIH Reporter. So the green line is TBI, and you can see what's happened is that since 2014, there's been a significant increase. And from the past 10 years, we've more than doubled our expenditure in TBI. Why is that? It's probably your program director. No, I mean, it's probably... It's probably because there are more people, and there's been a larger investment which has brought people in. You guys are probably writing better grants because the field's becoming more and more rigorous, and we're going to talk about how that's happened. But from a very cursory analysis of this portfolio, what you can see is that there's been now an acceptance and an increase in funding for mild TBI. So earlier in 2008, 2009, mild TBI was less well received by NIH study panels. So the important thing to remember, particularly for NINDS, is that we are an investigator-initiated institute, which means that you give us the ideas. They're reviewed by your peers, right? And then we fund the highest the highest scoring grants. That's our primary way that we fund grants, and then we try to fill in the holes. But this graph tends to suggest that either you guys are writing better grants, more people moving into the field and a higher interest. So I've compared it to, so you may just think that's NIH's funding in general. So that's why the blue line is there, which is a neurotrauma comparison, which is for spinal cord injury. And you can see spinal cord injury has had fairly flat funding over quite some time, and that's not a reflection on the field, but I think it's more of a reflection on the influx of more and more investigators and expanding the field of TBI that we're interested in. So what does the portfolio look like? And you probably can't read this because it's really small. I did a really simple analysis which just breaks it into clinical, preclinical, and both. So preclinical is in red, clinical is in blue and purple, because I remember my color schemes. So what you'll see is that we do fund at NINDS, this is just my portfolio, or the NINDS portfolio, we do fund more preclinical studies than clinical studies. But expenditure-wise, of course, clinical research is more expensive than preclinical research. So there's a larger expenditure towards preclinical research. And we're getting more and more preclinical research in, particularly as we accept more mild TBI. And it's across the span. So it is acute. There is a lot of diagnostics, but we're getting more and more on the more chronic effects. How do we treat this? How do we understand? How do we predict who's going to have symptoms chronically? One of the reasons I think that clinical research is expanding and accelerating at a rate I think that's slightly faster than the preclinical field is that many of you in this audience and my predecessors worked really hard to make a conscious decision to align and standardize outcomes using common data elements. So here you see all of these large consortium investments from Track TBI, which started as primarily an NINDS investment, but the DoD also funded it to CNC, which is what Stu was talking about, and other trials, which were using these common data elements, which allowed comparable data sets, which means you're using the same and most appropriate measures. As these are wrapping up, these data sets are starting to become available for secondary analysis, but they're also starting to do their primary analysis, one of which leads into biomarkers, which my institute director is very big into biomarkers. He's really interested, has started an entire new program in our Division of Translational Research on biomarker development. I know you all watched the open session of NINDS's council, which is where we talk about new concepts. And if you did, no one does. There's only like 12 people. And if you did, you'll find that there's a new discovery biomarkers RFA available that's coming out, and these are very large potential grants. And so and it's across neurological disorders, but TBI is, I think we're one of the disease areas thanks to what Dallas put together, which is like we have to understand what the FDA needs and what the field needs to advance biomarkers. We also currently have two FOAs for analytic validation. So if you have a biomarker, but you need to validate your assay in some way, these include imaging biomarkers as well, we will fund those experiments to show how sensitive and how reliable your analytic is. And then we also have a clinical validation FOA. So if you're Track TBI, you found a biomarker, but you need to do it in a larger data set in order to bring it to the FDA for approval, NINDS will fund if you get it reviewed well, we'll fund that and you can move it on. Another central premise is that we want to consolidate the resources. So you'll see in our FOAs now, we often require that you use the NINDS-funded biorepository as its central repository. The reason for that is not because we don't trust you with biobanks, but rather that when you're done and there are samples left over, we don't want you to have to manage that. We want to have that resource available so we can make it more publicly. And as these studies grow, we're going to have more and more available resources, and it's going to become more complex, but we'll all figure that out together. So what I'm hoping to do with the next initiative, so that initiative happened a while ago, that's CDEs in clinical research. What we're pushing for, and Doug's the first author here, but many people here were involved in this effort, was developing preclinical CDEs. Now that's not the same. So clinical CDEs tells you what instruments to use. This is really about transparency and reproducibility of preclinical data. Okay, so this is to say, if you're doing a certain test, if you're running a certain rat, what should you report, right? What do you need to measure in order for someone else to understand exactly what you did? And we're testing this right now in a consortium that just came up. Ina is in here, which is the Top NT. We call it the Top NT Consortium, in which we ask for people to come up with a new functional outcome measure for preclinical research that is currently clinically relevant. So it's something you could do in humans now, right? Not in the future, not some imaginary 11 Tesla magnet that, in humans will someday be able to do. This is translatable now. And so we took the best, review told us what the best ideas were, but we took those ideas, which were these 4 on the outside. One came from the University of Florida, one is at Georgetown and USIS, one is at UCLA, and that's Ina, is one of the PIs on that, and the other is at Hopkins. These are primarily blood-based biomarkers and imaging. And then we developed a centralized data repository at UCSF, which Susanna is here, she's part of that, and Adam Ferguson is running it. So he has an open where the data will be put. And what we're doing is he's created a data dictionary of the preclinical CDEs that we've already developed along with the DoD. And Leonie's here, she really ran that program. And so what we'll do is we'll end up with this analysis. And as the discovery phase comes in, which is here, the discovery phase is on top. So they discover, they replicate, they reproduce the result in their own lab. And the interesting part of this consortium is then you take that result and you have to move it to these other labs and reproduce the result there. So it's trying to start to produce group science using common data elements in the preclinical field to develop, in this case, functional outcome measures. And then the data will be shared and can be accessed by all at the end. The other big initiative that I wanted to point out was recently TBI was considered an emerging topic at the Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease-related dementia summit. Which is big news because this is an extra. Congress appropriated $2 billion, yes, that's $1 billion a year for this disease area. NINDS is a partner in this, so we get 10% of that, so we get an extra $200 million a year to spend on dementia-related research. So again, almost all of the people who helped develop, who worked on this, Doug Smith, Mary Jo Pugh, and Kristen Dams-O'Connor, who chaired it, are all here, and you can talk to them about that. And they came up with these recommendations. And I know there's a lot of them and you can't read them, so what I did was I said, I'm going to put up the websites because you can watch this. This is video cast. You can watch these great presentations, and there was an open discussion in the field. So the video cast link is below, and the picture of, with Henrik Zetterberg was there as well. And then the top one is actually the site where you can go download the entire recommendations across all disease areas that came out of this summit. The key here is that we are already funding TBI-related research that is relevant. It has to be relevant to understanding dementias. But if you do that, if you call me, if you think it is, I can help you. And we've already put out 2 RFAs, and I'm sorry for those of you people who had to apply to those RFAs and had 2 months of complete sleep deprivation, but I thank you for applying. And so hopefully this will gain momentum and help us understand better the chronic effects in TBI. I don't think I have another slide.
So good morning. My name is Carlos Peña. I'm the director for the Office of Neuro and Physical Medicine at the FDA. And I know some faces around here, but not all of them, which is a good thing because I'd like to make sure to introduce folks to medical device development, which I think has made some fantastic advances in the past, even just a couple of years, which I'll show a slide on. The other thing is that it would be a missed opportunity if there is lots of research funding in this area and there is no exit strategy for getting products to patients, which I think we're all interested in. So at FDA, we are interested in having patients have access to safe and effective medical devices of public health importance first in the world. And this is particularly at Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And we take that very seriously. I have some data to show for you. The seriousness of that vision. Here is shows you a couple of things. One is it's the review timelines of standing a IDE study, an Investigation Device Exemption study, up and running to full approval. And the studies are the basis for collecting data, for which the data is used to evaluate to getting medical devices to market. So you'll see in FY11 took about 400 plus days to get a study up and running, all the way down to 15, 16, 17. And I think 18 and 19 years, they're actually the 18 years, FY18 is tracking very similarly. It takes about 30 days for the median time to get full approval. That's fantastic because the faster you collect the data in an IDE study, the faster we can look at it and make a determination of whether that's ready to get to our patients. This also communicates a challenge that we have in making sure that our expectations are matched with yours. So we don't start studies that have safety concerns. The only way we get these studies up and running is if you know of our expectations with regard to getting those studies up and running. And forums like this that Magali has invited us to often help to do that. I think that we're only going to make this progress sustainable, which we are trying to figure that out on an ongoing basis, is if folks know what we're looking for in getting studies up and running or getting products to the marketplace. And there has been some advances in head injury products. And so here I show you a list of different products on the diagnostic side, the Banyan, the BrainScope, Impact, Infrascanner, and Oculogica. There's been some amazing advances in the past just even 5 years. And I think that's due to matching expectations between FDA and investigators in getting those products to market. You're going to hear a little bit more about this tomorrow with a colleague of mine, Mr. Michael Hoffman. He's going to be sharing with you a little bit more about these products as well as other biomarker and medical device development tools. But we can't make this progress without the communication and the expectations in place. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that's done at the agency, which I think is important to discuss in the TBI space if we were to make this list longer, which will be a good thing. Whoops. So the way we communicate our expectations to sponsors through guidance, and there are two guidances, particularly the pre-submission guidance, which allows us to have informational meetings with companies and sponsors to make sure that we know the data they're collecting, the outcome assessments, the tools that they're using. And then there's also more guidance about the device design development, design considerations for pivotal studies, expedited access for pre-market approval of medical devices. These are all ways that we share with sponsors the guidance development and moving these products to marketplace. And again, the forums like this help to communicate that this guidance is out there. I mentioned the pre-submissions pathway. This is an opportunity for FDA feedback upon very specific questions about device development. It also allows for an opportunity to have informational meetings to share with FDA when a product's just beginning development, which I think is important because you want to get our feedback even on the non-clinical studies, which can be very expensive and require resources. And it's free. It's a free process. So folks should take advantage of that because it's free. So it's a good thing, I think, when you have opportunities like this, because a couple years back, I think people didn't know much about FDA, like it's the black box. But I think now, people are understanding some of our expectations with regard to device development, at least on the device side. So a few closing remarks. And I was tracking on that monitor first with the other monitor. One is that if you think it's too early to contact FDA, that's the precise time to contact FDA. Many device development ventures are very expensive, non-clinical, clinical. They're long ventures. And so if we can map out the expectations, that helps you make budget decisions, funding decisions, personnel decisions. Two, I don't think we're going to be able to make more progress unless we have communication lines very open. And that means using the pre-submission process, which is free. And you should take advantage of that process, because I think it's very difficult for us to talk about a study data set after it's been done. It's been done, the study's over. It's very hard for us to say, oh, we were looking for the other outcome assessment. And three, if you're wondering about like what's for lunch, I didn't really pay attention to the talk, my contact information is there. And we also have Mike Hoffman here, and we're going to have some other staff tomorrow. Contact us. I think you'll be surprised with the interaction you get at FDA. Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. I'm a late arrival here. I'm just getting all the clearances through. My name is Saafan Malik. I'm with the Defense and Veterans Brain Injury Center. Currently here to give you an overview about DoD programs and priorities, representing the Research and Development Directorate for Defense Health Agency. So just giving you a landscape on the DoD front, I would not dive down into kind of a lot of project level or funding level, but I want to give you an overview of the processes and how complex and slightly different than what Pat was just mentioning, that it's not kind of an investigator initiative kind of approach. It's really more requirements-based approach. That's where I'm going to be coming from. And I represent an organization that is going to probably be leading a lot of effort on R&D front for the whole military health system, which is a Defense Health Agency, and within the Defense Health Agency, the Research and Development Directorate, which is a J9 section. But we do really closely work with all the rest of the DoD partners, CNRM, Dr. Brody, NICO, our MRMC folks, Medical Research Material Command, and traditionally you have heard a lot from, in days from Colonel Hack to Colonel Rasmussen, Colonel Davis now, and there's a lot of different kind of roles each of these organizations play. So I'm going to quickly touch upon some of these and then give you a kind of very brief view on what kind of really the full cycle of research approach DoD is taking. Not only just executing it, but also how it is really important for us, for our stakeholders, for our service members, and the actual customers to have that something applied and be ready for them so they're doing their jobs. So just moving forward, I have no disclosures to report here. Going to this next slide, you must have seen this. DivBig publishes the surveillance numbers for DoD-wide, and traditionally in the past several years has been really on the mild front. And there's a breakdown of each services, and it's really heavy on Army that bears the burden of TBI. But it still highlights the problem that is still a significant issue for DoD, and DoD is seriously committed through all kind of ways, means to address TBI for our stakeholders within the military health system. But this military health system has been really complex. It's not kind of a closed loop system like you will find in a typical academic or a civilian sector. We have different services, we have different kind of components to it, and it's a full gamut of from education training to medical R&D to public health. But this complexity does offers us this integration. It's really complex and big, but it still helps us to have those handoffs and crosstalks where we would need to invest in the TBI front, which can then be translatable into findings for the clinical care for our patients. So that's the complex system, but the approach will give us the most comprehensive view and application as we move forward on the requirements-driven front to find solutions for TBI. So just to highlight here, what is a key central focus here, based off the requirements-driven approach, is the readiness piece for the DoD. And obviously we work with our partners, VA, NIH, and can really close the loop on where they can feed their pieces, and then how we focus on the readiness piece to make sure that we have medically ready force, and then that force is also supported by fully equipped medical components that they can support them when they're out fighting the fight for us. But overall, it's the better health, better care, and kind of really lower cost, but the central piece is increased readiness. So I'm just giving kind of an overview of how the overall lens of DoD kind of really is focused on right now. And moving forward, we have seen conflicts in the past with OIF, OEF, but in the next future battle space and how may things evolve, we need to be ready and have our role kind of really queued up. So we invest into the right portfolios, the right elements in collaboration with our partners on VA, HHS, and in works with FDA to fill in the gaps where we would have to. So just moving quickly to say that how DoD has approached this, again, from gaps driven on the left side to the application to product development on the right side, DoD really invests through different mechanisms. We have our strategic guidance, which I'll show you a slide in a minute. But in this bookshelf concept, we invest all the way from 6.1 to 6.4 on the S&T efforts, where we support intramural and extramural labs with a lot of basic preclinical work and science and technology foundational basis. And then moving towards, on the right side, we do a lot of clinical research studies, employ a lot of centers of excellence have came into being for the last several years, and working across our uniformed services university to build the basis of all these knowledge products that they can eventually go towards the right side to develop products. And those products could be educational products, those could be in the form of tools, technologies that have emerged from our different investments to be able to then test them and can really work with the FDA to be able to have a usable, either something for the line leader or something that may be applied to our stateside care for the TBI. So just giving you a glimpse of that, this bookshelf is really organized in partnership with our academia and other federal partners. This is an overall strategy view of how DoD views on the TBI front. And again, like you can see, my slides are not really down to the project level. There's a lot of projects and programs that DoD supports, but giving you a glimpse of where we are coming from. So these guidance and requirements do come from executive level, from Congress, from a lot of capability development documents that each of the services produce together. And those then kind of really go through Defense Health Program dollars or program dollars from Army or their own services kind of core programs. And then they all address different fronts, try to reduce duplication and try to synergize effort. And then there are your execution managers, which are in the form of different joint program committees, but they all work together and have this kind of organized view throughout the year where they can kind of really see their progress and then evolve their investments into as the requirements evolve. So that's why you'll see in this coming years, as the focus has been on the mild TBI front, there may be some changes that we're going to start investing in some other areas. And obviously you have folks from MRC here, JB Phillips is here, that can really talk in a more kind of a project level and programs at how they're executing it. So I'll encourage you to kind of reach out to those folks who can really talk more. But how they do is they announce those in the form of program announcements and broad agency and war announcements where they want to kind of really get more performers to come in, either intramurally or extramurally, to fill in research gaps. I don't want to go into too much detail on these few next slides, but I wanted to highlight again the National Research Action Plan that we have really partnered with our federal colleagues here. And the focus has been really towards trying to find a clinically actionable biomarker, looking at improving our diagnostic criteria. And there are really several progress areas also. In the full circle of knowledge translation, we have updated our products, which have been in play in the past several years, like the Military Acute Concussion Evaluation, the MACE tool. You've all heard about that. That got updated to a MACE-2 tool, which then not only incorporates the traditional updated evidence that is out in the literature, but also incorporates any multimodal fronts that we have made progress, like vestibular, oculomotor. And those are now in this updated tool, which is now in the hands of actual users. And we have also employed our efforts to try to train our providers that are actually using these tools. So it's not only just the research kind of really investing, but also seeing it all the way through to going to the clinical side, have the clinical impact, and then you can see the improvements coming in, or at least be ready for if next future brings us something, new challenge, we're better prepared and are equipping our clinician, our medics on the front lines to take care of these patients. So this next slide is another kind of just a quick view of some of the recent accomplishments. You may have heard about the Benin biomarker update, how it has kind of really came out and got approved from the FDA in assisting the referral for CDEs. The CARE Consortia, you may have heard about that came out with new guidelines on return to play. Just mentioning the same deal on the same front, DoD through different centers of excellence do also produce some clinical recommendations, and where we employ our clinicians, which are in services, to come contribute to it, to update those protocols, SOPs, where our research, what is kind of really pushing on the left side, is then getting incorporated in the form of high level of evidence to improve the clinical care guidelines, because that's our ultimate goal, to be able to fill the requirement which is needed, either on the knowledge front or on the product front. So just moving quickly in this last slide, again, like I mentioned, I think you probably saw my theme here. It's really focused on the full gamut of knowledge translation, investing into the right gaps through the right requirements, and then really seeing it through to flourish into a knowledge products or material product, and then be able to give into the hands of the users and then study those to make sure that every time we update those. The Maze 2 was mentioned. On the same front, and then in the evolving future battle space, there may be more need towards kind of a severe form of TBIs. So for those reasons, there's a high kind of in collaboration with the Joint Trauma System, which really is focused on all the trauma care in theater. And we have worked with them to kind of come up with new CPGs that is extracted from all our investments from preclinical side to all the way to clinical research that I showed the bookshelf earlier. And those are updated. And that basically also helps to drive some of the gaps, the emerging needs. In short, I think I would kind of close here to state that the goal here is to stay relevant, to have a ready force, and basically keep strengthening our partnerships with our other federal colleagues, VA, DoD, FDA, and then really modernize our managing of this research infrastructure. Because the military health system that I described is really complex, and it is really getting more synergized with the Defense Health Agency coming into play and trying to coordinate all of these. There's guidance and direction that many of the military treatment facilities will come under Defense Health Agency's management, which will further strengthen to utilize, let's suppose, EMRs, and then really be on with the ground requirements where what is needed to invest in our portfolio, and then better coordination of these portfolio through our execution managers, and then streamlining this with joint program committees and all those BAs and PAs that come out. So I kept a very high level just on the purpose because, first of all, I was short in time, and then secondly, I think I got the approvals a bit late in the game. So I apologize if you did not see any kind of funding announcements that announced up there. Those I will defer to my colleagues from MRC. But it's just a flavor of giving you an overview of DoD's approach and the complexities. And from here, this is my last slide. I'll definitely be happy to answer any questions for you. Thank you.
This panel is open for discussion, and I welcome any questions.
First of all, I just want to say thank you for those of you who have supported my research in the past. I know there's at least a couple of you on the panel who have, and for those of you who haven't yet, there's always an opportunity. But we really appreciate your dedication to this sector. My question relates to definitions. I know that you guys have worked extremely hard, particularly at FDA, to establish a clinical reference standard so that, for example, when someone gets hit in the head, we have a word that we can call it. And, we try to call it concussion, and we try to use, I think the DoD VA reference standard is an excellent, outstanding reference standard, but we also know that it doesn't completely encompass the total pathophysiology of the problem, and that like what we call concussion in some people is going to last 7 days because it's one type of pathophysiology, but in other people it's going to last 3 weeks because it's a different type of pathophysiology. So how do we reconcile this? And then, to add complexity to this question, so we've got trying to define the clinical reference standard acutely, then you've got your chronic effects of neurotrauma. And the public tends to call all of it CTE, but we know that there's a diversity of pathology there too, and it's not all the same. So what can we do as a community to work with you to make things easier so that you guys can help us find solutions?
Is that directed towards FDA? So one thing is, a couple of comments. One is, forums like this help us understand how terms are being used in the community. We get educated about the terminology. The other way, it's a two-way street, and we share with folks about different indications for use about the products that we're reviewing. And oftentimes, the indications for use, which uses that terminology, will be very detailed. We spend lots of times on the indications for use for products. And many of those times, we will pick an indication for use that matches very closely, it tracks very closely to how the product was studied in the clinical study. So, while there may be some gray areas using concussion or mild TBI or head injury, we help to specify that IFU with additional information on how that product is to be used and how it's used the most safe and effective way possible in that patient population. So, there's two approaches. One is to have further consensus and development of these terms because they are confusing, I think. And two is, at least at the FDA, we try to further specify IFUs for products, drugs, devices, biologics, by how they were studied in the clinical study. Because then physicians have all the information they need to make an informed risk-benefit ratio for their product, for their patients with the products that they're using. But I don't have a very specific answer because terms continue to fluctuate and grow and move.
So in part, and the other part of it is that I hear often that this is what we need, but the challenge is that we've invested in research, right, that's trying to provide those answers. And what I always find, and I have a lot of sympathy for the researchers, is that we give them the award for track or sensei, and what people want is the answer the next year, right? So it's a slow-moving process, and JAM is part of this. It's redefining. Every meeting I think I've ever been to wants to get rid of mild, moderate, and severe, but yet we're still waiting for enough data to really provide a new system that is going to be generally accepted. Because I can propose, I sat down with I won't name his name once, I think it was actually this meeting a couple of years ago, and said, this is what we need, and he wrote it down on a napkin. But the problem is that, it was actually a pretty cool system, but the problem is that you need that to be accepted by the community, and to get broad acceptance by the community so that we're all using the same terms, we're all agree that this is the nomenclature that is most important is the challenge. And that's why we're trying to provide evidence with Track TBI, with Sensei, with JOM's efforts. And I think we're going to get there. It's just a slow process. Alzheimer's, if you go to the Alzheimer's disease summits, you'll see they have the same problem, right? It's all still lumped together as Alzheimer's disease. And they're trying to work through this exact same problem. It's just that they have an order of magnitude more funding to do it.
Yeah. Yes, Don Stein.
I was in China not too long ago visiting Qingdao, and the Chinese are taking a slightly different approach that I'm wondering if you think it's important. I know the NIH has a center for the study of alternative medicine. The Chinese are looking at a much more holistic approach and spending like $60 billion in building a new medical school in Qingdao to study other alternatives to the more traditional high technology, molecular reductionistic biology approaches that are that really been prevalent in the presentations here today. I'm just wondering if you think there's any value in considering also some of these alternative approaches. I know the Center for Alternative Medicine doesn't get, the cost of one wheel on a tank, but is it worth pursuing any of this from your perspectives?
Well, in the sense that the blood that flows through your big toe also flows through your brain, yes, the whole body is affected by the brain injury. And also if there's systemic injury, I think Grant Iverson has shown that it can affect how the brain functions. So yes, it's all connected, not just by blood, but just by what is flowing through the body. And so inflammatory factors can affect behavior. There is a holistic approach there that you cannot study in a dish. You can't make assumptions about biomarkers when you study that in a dish and relate that to a typical polytrauma situation. And that a lot of that information is lost when you come to the real world. So it does make sense at a certain level. That would be my comment on that.
Yeah, so I think there's also a slight kind of, even if you look at the brain, we have made kind of very tiny steps towards even considering domains like your oculomotor deficits, your vestibular issues that have not traditionally been, considered as, brain is right there, and there's part of the functions of your whole brain. And now we're starting to see those domains come into play of understanding if there are certain symptom clusters that are relevant, findings within just the brain itself, not as a whole body. So there has been very slow progress, and we have not really embraced to go beyond. We stay focused just on a neuron, and we stay there, and it started to open up it. Unless we kind of expand that as investigator initiative kind of really view, I support that idea to go after these other domains where we have really remained focused on just brain, and not even brain itself has been comprehensively tied together. But there are some progresses. Like I said, the vestibular ocular components, now they're becoming a part of assessments, and people are looking at these symptom clusters and can really try to profile it from a bit broader view of just the brain, like a memory function or just sort of one-offs.
And Don, and we do accept these trials. I think the challenge has been, particularly alternative approaches. I think one of the challenges is they run into challenges at review. So it's really a level of what is the evidence that this is going to be successful, and then how well can they design the study to really clearly, to the scientific requirements that review panels ask for. And that I think that's been a stumbling block in this area. But from the NINDS perspective, our goal is to improve the patients' lives. And so I don't care if it's a small molecule or a biologic or massage therapy, whatever is going to work to improve their lives. That's what we want to fund, and that's what we try to fund.
Yeah, and another concept is when you come up with a new paradigm, let's say looking at TBI in the chronic, in a preclinically, in a chronic, over chronic time points, and you want to look at repetitive brain injury, how many hits in a preclinical model is relevant to the real world situation? What time points are you looking at? When does it become chronic? And I remember when we had our RFA that came out in 2011, the first round of applications that came in really were fights over the correct methodology and also terminology. And so so when you go into something that's more holistic and try to bring into a lot of these study sections and that are neuro-based, there is a breakdown in communication between the applicant and the reviewers, and that just needs time to develop.
This is working. You both presented data on the increasing investment over time in this space, but then Patrick, at the end, you said, but it's still significantly less than Alzheimer's disease. And I thought it's interesting, thinking I'm getting too close to that thing again. A few years ago, industry had stepped away from Alzheimer's disease. ADNI was formed. We brought industry, public-private partnership together. There was an infusion of investment, an infusion of engagement, and as we've seen, the Alzheimer's disease grew tremendously. Now, granted, the successes haven't been where we need them to be, but there has been a significant increase in investment. In traumatic brain injury and PTSD, I don't see those type of industry and government and academic partnerships as much. Do they exist? And if they don't, why not?
Well, there are some. So we participate in INTBR, which is has non-federal partners in it, where we're trying to bring together international groups to align data and do data analysis and do validation across studies. But remember the funding for Alzheimer's. Look, like I said, we're investigator initiated, so that curve could go down as well. We don't just say we have $130 million for TBI, right? As you saw, $60 million. It's how well the grants do, and so. That's why I'm saying that that increase is likely due to better science being done in TBI is really what I think it's attributable to. But the partnerships, we see other neurological disorders where there are partnerships, and I think that you're exactly right. Is that one thing that I don't get a lot of is conversations with nonprofit organizations about how we could leverage particular investments. And I think that that's one of the best ways nonprofits can help. So Track TBI has been incredibly successful in bringing in other groups to help them leverage and do other studies. And, and I think that that can be expanded more broadly, particularly with our larger and larger investment.
Yeah. Also, I think TBI research area has been really affected by the lack of industry investment, but it's neurosciences in general. We both sit on the National Academy Forum where that has been brought up numerous times, that the lack of investment from private industry in the neurosciences, clinical neurosciences, is actually a major problem. But there's been, the collaboration that has with FDA and I guess NIH and DoD on the TBI endpoint development. That's headed by Jeff Manley. And I think industry is also waiting for the outcome of that initiative to maybe have further investment, because that's going to supposedly develop standards that will standardize these clinical trials with real outcome measures.
Do you think it would help, oh, sorry, I was just going to wonder if it would help to bring PTSD and TBI together in a framework at all?
Yeah, I mean, from the FDA's perspective, is the list that I tried to show had an explosion of advances in the past 5 years. From our perspective, when folks come in early with pre-submissions, that really sort of lays the runway for these products to get to the marketplace. Especially going back to the other question about terminology, if we have the pre-submissions about terminology even, about the IFUs that people want to get, and we could sort of lay the groundwork here about appropriate terminology, you're mapping everything out. There's no unknowns, which I think is going to be also, on the other side, having an exit strategy for all the research that's involved in this space. They are definitely free.
So just real quickly, so one example of where this is working really well, and so the reason AD has more money is because Congress appropriated it. The reason the PAIN initiative has more money is because Congress said NIH spend money on this. But that PAIN money, which is called the HEAL initiative at NIH, is a great example of bringing together for-profits, so the pharmaceuticals, the nonprofits, and federal partners are working together to develop networks, both preclinically and clinically, to advance research in pain research. And if that's the sort of, we could do it, we'd have to do it at a much smaller scale because we don't have congressional mandate, at least at NIH, to do TBI research. But I think that's where we could partner.
I want to thank everyone for the great questions and my colleagues here for their presentations.